much more there is for me to say, but as beautiful as a day is today after so many unpleasant ones with rain, it's hard to talk about a city which is unfortunately so full of conflict. Jerusalem, as has been mentioned earlier, is a city sacred to three religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. One translation of the city, of Jerusalem, means the city of peace. Yet, so many bloody wars have been fought over it, including the Crusades, where blood literally ran in the streets. And as recently as January of this year, 1981, Saudi Arabia proclaimed a jihad, or holy war, to regain the city for Islam. How can one explain the fact that the city of peace, Jerusalem, has been conquered 37 times and seems more a city of war than a city of peace? Well, I think for our purposes this evening, it's necessary to deal with three central issues in trying to understand the very difficult topic of the role of Jerusalem as an element in the Arab-Israeli conflict. First of all, we have to try to understand the Arab-Israeli conflict itself. Secondly is the issue of the sovereignty over the holy places. You have in your map of Jerusalem from 1948 to 1967 a very nice delineation of the holy places primarily in the Old City. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is holy for Christians, the Western Wall of the Temple, holy for Jews, as well as the cemetery on the Mount of Olives, and the Mosque of Omar and Al-Aqsa Mosque right next to the Western Wall, in fact, contiguous to it, holy for Jews. So the issue of access and control over the holy places is an issue. The issue of sovereignty over the entire city, which is a lot larger than the area where the holy places are an issue. And finally, the dynamics of the Arab-Israeli conflict itself. Now, each of these three factors interact and intertwine, and what I'm going to try to do tonight is show how they all interrelate. Now, looking back just a little bit into history, I think it's necessary to take a historical background to understand the problem as it exists today. Being a historian at heart, not only having maps, but also I think I'm a believer that history is to a people the same way a memory is to a person. And you have to remember the past in order to understand which way the future is likely to go. Jerusalem first enters into our consciousness about 3,000 years ago, year 1000 BC, when David, the second king of Israel, conquered the city from a Canaanite tribe, the Jebusites, and transformed what had been a Canaanite city-state into not only the national capital of the Jewish people, but also the first capital of a monotheistic religion. And the temple to worship one God was built by Solomon, his son. Now the Jews, or ancient Hebrews, held on to Jerusalem until the year 586 BC, when it was destroyed by the Babylonians. 50 years later, however, and you remember the story of Ezra and Nehemiah from the Bible, Jews came back under Cyrus, continued to hold Jerusalem and the general area until it was conquered by the Greeks. The Jews in the days of the Greeks recovered it, only to lose it again to the Romans, and some of you may have seen Masada on television for a very histrionic version of what happened. There was another Jewish rebellion against Rome, by the way, as late as 135 AD, and Jerusalem was temporarily reconquered. But the initial imprint on the city came from the Jews, the building of two temples. The Christian input comes a few hundred years later under Constantine, who by that time was ruling in Byzantium, the city which is now Constantinople. He took over control of Jerusalem and built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ was buried. This brought in, and I'd like you to remember this, a major Greek, or what became a Greek Orthodox input into Jerusalem. And it was the Greek Orthodox Christianity which really dominated Jerusalem from a Christian point of view until the Crusades. And I want to come back to this later. The Muslim input comes in a few centuries later. Jerusalem was captured in 638 AD, and two caliphs built major mosques, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, where Muhammad, it is felt in Islamic tradition, went to heaven. Both were built, by the way, on the hill where the temples had stood, the first and second temples. Another fact which is very relevant to our analysis today. with the initial Greek input, which remained, as did a Jewish input under the Muslims. The next big input was one of Latin Christianity, Roman Catholicism at the time of the Crusades. Crusaders captured Jerusalem in the year 1099, liquidated not only the Muslim and Jewish presence in the city, but also the Greek Orthodox presence as well. At this point, Catholicism moved in, took over the churches, Church of the Holy Sepulchre and others, and injected and built a Latin, what we call a Latin Christian presence. It was recaptured by the Kurd working with Arab Saladin in 1187, and the conflict over the city continued. It was recaptured temporarily by the Crusaders, but then recaptured again by the Arabs. A Turkic people, the Mamluks, had it from the 14th and 15th centuries to the early 16th century when the Turks captured it. And it's the Turkish imprint on Jerusalem which really has had a very lasting effect. The Turks controlled Jerusalem for exactly 400 years, from the year 1517 to 1917. Now, because for most of this period, Greece was under Turkish control, the Greeks were favored in their contest with the Roman Catholics, that is, the Greek Orthodox, and the Roman Catholics and the Armenians were all vying for control of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and also the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And the contest was not a diplomatic contest as we might know it here in the United States, but often degenerated into some bloody battles as priests of both sides wielded candlesticks and hit each other over the head over matters which we would feel today from the Western American point of view as inconsequential. But things like who cleans the top step of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre became very, very important, because if you clean the step, that gives you a proprietary right to it. If you clean a wall, it got to the point where you were not allowed to put the ladder against the wall, lest that give you the right to it. You had to lean up the ladder straight up and reach over and try to clean. Now, the contest between the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholics for control over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was cleverly played by the Turks, who often would play one side off against the other. At a time when the Turks needed French support against Russia and against other enemies, they granted the French something called capitulations, which gave the French Catholics the primary rights in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. However, when the Europeans were all fighting each other, the Sultan would issue a firman, which is a religious decree giving back to the Greek Orthodox the control over the holy places. Now, this playing off one side against the other, and I can give you some years on this. For example, 1740, a capitulation to the French. 1757, a firman giving it back to the Greek Orthodox. Now, this reached the point of international conflict in the year 1852-1853. The French, who were on the short end of the stick, demanded an increased Catholic presence in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Turks, worrying about the Russians, decided, well, we're going to issue a decree once and for all, and this was called the Decree on the Status Quo of the Holy Places, issued in 1852. This was not sufficiently satisfactory to the Russians, and soon there was war between Russia and Turkey, with Britain and France coming to aid the Turks. The end result of the whole process was that up until the time that the British took control of Jerusalem in the year 1917, the status quo held with the Greek Orthodox in primary position, the Roman Catholics in secondary position. Now, while the holy places were going in that direction, lots of interesting things were happening in the city of Jerusalem and in the whole area of Palestine itself. The big powers were rapidly building up. The French in particular were building schools. There were many consulates set up. The European powers, after having helped the Turks against the Russians in the 1850s, were becoming increasingly active. Meanwhile, there was an increasingly large Jewish community resident in Jerusalem. By 1844, if one looks at the numbers here, the Jews had the largest religious community in Jerusalem, some 7,000. The Muslims had 5,000. Christians had 3,300. This had risen by the year 1905 to 40,000 Jews, 7,000 Muslims, and 13,000 Christians, as the Jews began to move back in large numbers in the 19th century to augment the existing Jewish community. But all of this pales into what is close to insignificance when one deals with World War I, which cuts across every single one of the key issues one has to know about Jerusalem. The Arab-Israeli conflict, control over the city of Jerusalem, and control over the holy places. These three issues. Okay, why? If we go back to World War I, we're really in the early stages of the war dealing with the diplomacy of the 19th century. The history of the diplomacy of the 19th century was as follows. If you're a European power and you fight against another European power, and that European power loses, how does he pay? With his colonies. And this was the expectation of the British and the French, the early parts and the middle and even the end of World War I, not worrying about Woodrow Wilson's idealism at the time, as to how they would treat the Turks, because the Turks, as you recall, were fighting on the side of the Germans and Austrians against the British, French, Russians, and of course later the United States. Well, early on in the war, the British and the French and the Russians and even the Italians, who came in, as you know, in April of 1915, were deciding who's going to get what piece. And they continued the negotiations, Russia early being given control over the Straits. But Britain and France, I should mention, while making their deals over dividing the area, were also pretty desperate during World War I. And if I may give a personal aside for a moment, even though I was not there, obviously, during World War I, when I was teaching at West Point about 10 years ago, I had an exchange student in my class from Sandhurst, which is the British Military Academy. And I was giving a talk, and my theory as to the Arab-Israeli conflict of today hails primarily from the contrary promises made by the British during World War I. And I went through and listed every one of the contrary promises, which I'm sure most of you are aware of here. And he comes up to me after class, he says, "You're right, Captain Freedman, but please remember, we were fighting for our lives during World War I, and every bit of support we could get mattered and was desperate." Well, let me just go into a couple of these promises the British made, because they sowed the seeds of trouble later. 1915 and 1916, a correspondence was made between the British and the resident in Egypt named McMahon, and one of the Arab leaders in the Arabian desert, over here, Sharif Hussein, who was about ready to lead a rebellion against the Turks who controlled the entire area. The question was, of course, under what circumstances? Sharif Hussein wanted a large Arab state from southern Turkey down here to the Arabian Sea and from Iran over, not including Egypt, which at that time was under British control. The British were not willing to go that far, excluding certain areas, but also, very importantly, excluding non-Arab areas to the west of a series of provinces, including the Vilayet, or province of Damascus, which left out modern-day Israel as well as Lebanon. Right, this was the British understanding. It was a vague promise. Indeed, it was just an exchange of correspondence. The Arabs went to war on the expectation, but without any written treaty as to exactly what they were going to get. Meanwhile, in 1917, a similar vague promise was made to the Jews. This was the Balfour Declaration. As again, I'm sure most of you know, the Zionist movement was a late nationalist movement in 19th century Europe. It became important, as had Arab nationalism at the start of the war, although neither Arab nationalism, as exemplified by Sharif Hussein, nor Zionism, as exemplified in the middle of World War I by Chaim Weizmann, was a majority movement. Neither Zionism among the Jews nor Arab nationalism among the Arabs. Nonetheless, they were important in the war, and the British, desperate for help, called upon both of them. In any case, the promise to the Zionists, hoping for their own homeland in Israel, was, quote, and it's important to note the quote here, a national home in Palestine. Note the vagueness. What is a national home? It's a very vague concept. In Palestine. Where? Open question. So the two belligerents of the war called in to try to help the British cause. Vague promises were made. However, to the French, very specific negotiations went underway, because these were obviously the key allies, and these had a long history of interest in the Middle East. Under the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, Britain was to get the dominant role in Iraq, the French in Syria, And Palestine, essentially all of Palestine except for Haifa and Akko, was to be an international zone. All of Palestine, not just Jerusalem. Why? The French wanted all of Palestine to be part of Syria. The British were afraid that the French would become too powerful because they already had major investments in Syria. And the Russians, remember the Russian Orthodox Catholic conflict, were very unwilling to let the French have predominance either in Jerusalem or in Palestine as a whole, where there were a number of Russian Orthodox churches outside of Jerusalem. The end result was a compromise. Okay. Palestine as a whole is internationalized, quote unquote. But after the war, things change. Russia has had its revolution, doesn't count anymore. There's a peace treaty at Versailles. Well, the Arabs come up to the peace treaty at Versailles, personified by the son of Sharif Hussein, Faisal, and say, well, where's my independent Arab state? The Jews, personified by Chaim Weizmann, come up and say, where's my national home in Palestine? And the irony of the whole business is, in 1919, there was cooperation initially between the Arabs on the one hand and the Zionists on the other. Indeed, Faisal wrote to a representative of the American delegation, Felix Frankfurter, with the information that the Zionist movement is nationalist and not imperialist. We of the Arab movement are nationalist and not imperialist. There is room in Syria for us both. Very interesting, 1919. This was predicated, however, and a treaty was signed between the two on the assumption that this whole area would become Arab, an Arab state, with a region for the Jews over here. Wonderful. What happened? Well, the French and British, to put it mildly, decided that there would not be an Arab state, there would not be a Jewish state. They themselves would dominate the key areas of the Middle East. So as a result of the war, the British picked up all of Palestine and all of Iraq. The French picked up all of Syria and all of Lebanon. The Arabs were left with the sandy wastes of the Arabian desert, and nobody knew at that time had any oil. Well, this is where the tragedy of the Arab-Israeli conflict, in my view, comes in. The Arab expectation had been for an Arab state. All of a sudden, they say the British and French ensconcing themselves on the key areas of the region. The British and French with troops, wearing European clothes, speaking European language, with European culture, coming down, entrenching themselves in Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, and leading to Arab rebellions against the French and the British. At the same time, interestingly enough, another group of Europeans, speaking European languages, wearing European clothes with a European culture, was also coming to the Middle East, this time settling in Palestine. These were the Zionists from Europe coming to join the existing Jewish community in Palestine. And the dilemma was this. The Arabs perceived the Zionists coming to Palestine after World War I, not as Faisal had said, fellow nationalists looking for an independent state, but, and this is key, part of the overall European imperialist wave which washed over the Middle East at the end of World War I. And that's the key problem. It's one of perception, and the same Arab perception of Israel and the Zionist movement as imperialists came in right after World War I and remained essentially until 1977, when Sadat goes to Jerusalem and says, we welcome you here to the Middle East. This was the first major change in Arab perception from this perception of imperialism, which you hear very much even to today. All right, that's the final story. What happens, though, with the question of the holy places? Remember, Britain got the right over Palestine, but who's going to get the right over the holy places? The French were very unhappy with the British for a number of reasons at the end of World War I, but they said they only agreed to the division of the area if they would be predominant in Jerusalem. The Vatican comes in, sees a wonderful opportunity to make up for the Greek Orthodox dominance, and it pushes for a dominant position in Jerusalem. The British accede to pressure and say, okay, what we will do is organize an international commission to try to determine who has what right in the holy places, primarily the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Fine, who's going to be on the commission? Vatican wants a representative, Spain wants a representative, France wants a representative, England wants a representative and also claims to protect the Orthodox. The end result of this is, first of all, no one can agree who's going to be on the commission, nobody can agree who's going to be president of the commission, and the idea of an international commission dies. In 1924, Britain takes over and says it will protect the holy places. So the question of sovereignty over the city is British, the question of protection over the holy places is British. Okay, that brings us back to the Arab-Israeli conflict as it emerged in the 1920s and 1930s. There were riots against the Jews by the Arabs in 1920, 1921, 1929, one of which involved the Western Wall of the Temple in 1936 to 1939. Let me try to deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict in the 1920s and 30s, again on the basis of the holy places, on the basis of Jerusalem, basis of the overall attitude. From the Arab point of view, both Christian and Jew had the position under Turkish domination, under previous Arab domination of protected vassals or dhimmi, where it's clear the Arabs would have the key political clout, but the Christians and Jews would be tolerated. The problem was, by the 1920s and 1930s, the Jews were pressing them forward, at least for equality in the position. If you read carefully the Balfour Declaration, looked to be at least primus inter pares. And there's an issue of conflict there. Second problem was, and this is psychological here, these have been second-class citizens, were now thrusting themselves to be first-class citizens. So you have this kind of culture shock. You have other kinds of culture shock, different language. Many of the early ideas of the Zionist immigrants were socialist, which conflicted in great detail with the feudal ideas of many of the large Arab landowners. A third problem, however, was one of the holy places. The British, in an effort to win over Arab public opinion, had appointed one of the rioters of 1920 and 21, the Mufti al-Husseini. He was appointed to be chief mufti, Haji Min al-Husseini to be chief mufti, to be in charge of the religious establishment which controlled the Waqf, which is a large amount of charity money, which could be distributed for, as you might say in the United States, for patronage purposes. Al-Husseini took an extremist position from the beginning, built up his own following, tried to eliminate the rival Nashashibi family and others. Meanwhile, as far as the Jews went, he refused to recognize any legal presence for the Jews. The British offered to set up a municipal council. In many cases, he rejected it. What is of interest to us here, however, was the attitude toward the Western Wall of the Temple, and this is important. Again, if you look at the map, and some of you can see down here, small map, the Western Wall of the Temple, the only remnant of the Second Temple of Jerusalem, is part of the Temple Mount where Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock are. Haji Min al-Husseini claimed, and let me give you a quote of one of his statements, "The Jews crying and kissing the wall does not stem from their love for the wall itself, but from their heartfelt aspiration to gain control over the Haram al-Sharif, that is, the mount where the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa are." The key dispute in 1929 was, do Jews have the right to pray at the wall, which after all fronts the mount, and if so, under what conditions? Remember what I mentioned earlier about the question of who dusts the wall of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. On Orthodox Judaism, as I think most everybody knows here, on Orthodox Judaism, the women and the men pray separately. There's something called a mechitza, or a separation. There's an effort for the Jews to bring about something, a platform separating the two in 1929. This was declared totally illegal by the Arabs, who protested to the British. There are other problems it was a very narrow area before the wall. The Arabs would drive cattle during the passageway, use loudspeakers, and generally make life difficult. Meanwhile, the Jews claimed this is ours and the Arabs shouldn't do it. Who's going to be in control of the holy places? The British. The British came up with a solution, 1931, which is an attempt to be even-handed and compromise. On the one hand, they said the Arabs could not drive animals through this area and could not use loudspeakers at the same time the Jews were praying. On the other hand, the Jews could not use any benches for people to sit down on, no separations or mechitzas, no blowing of the shofar. And again, for those of you who are familiar with the Jewish religion, I think you'll find this almost amusing, that the Torah, the Jewish religious law, which is read 3 times a week, Monday, Thursday, and on the Sabbath day, as well as on Jewish holidays. The Torah could be written, according to the British, could be read at the wall only on holidays, but not on the Sabbath or not during the week. Well, as you might expect, that Jews were not happy about this. Now, compounding the problem was the fact that by 1939, 60% of the population in Jerusalem were Jewish, 21% Muslim, and 18% Christian. But there was an Arab mayor. The Jews felt, we have the majority of the population, we should have the mayor. The Arabs said no. The first mayor was appointed as a Muslim in 1877. Therefore, on purpose of precedent, there should be a Muslim mayor. Now, as the Arab-Israeli conflict became particularly nasty in the late 1930s, the Jews said, this is our land. The Arabs said, this is our land. The British, as was their custom, sent in yet another international commission to determine who was going to be in charge. This was the Peel Commission, and it probably made the best decision of any international commission ever studying the Arab-Israeli conflict. What they did, after a very long look at the rioting going on, they said, look, it would be nice if the Arabs and Jews could live together. They can't. It would be unfair. The Jews, at that time 400,000, should dominate about 950,000 Arabs, or the Arabs, 950,000, should dominate 400,000 Jews, because they list all sorts of areas where minorities have been persecuted in the Middle East. The conclusion was, however, that if neither side can have all of it, both sides can have a part of it. So the Peel Commission came up with the idea of partition. That is, dividing Palestine into a Jewish section and into an Arab section. Meanwhile, leaving Jerusalem, and here's how this one goes, as a permanent British mandate. And here we can now shift over to this map, leaving Jerusalem as a permanent British mandate with a direct corridor to the sea. That was the Peel Commission. After the war and the Holocaust, as Jews had nowhere to go but Israel, the United States got dragged into the negotiations. I should mention that the Arabs rejected the Peel Commission. The Jews accepted it, but only conditionally as a form of negotiation, but not in its own form. After World War II, the British got very weak. The United States was dragged in. A joint Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry was formed. And it suggested, as a solution for the Arab-Israeli conflict, ultimately 2 separate cantons with the ultimate form of government in Jerusalem and Palestine still to be left open. However, and I'm quoting now, whatever government emerged had to fully protect the interests of Christendom, Islam, and Judaism in the Holy Land. That was 1946. 1947, the British finally threw up their hands and said, we can't control Palestine anymore, dumped it on the laps of the UN. The UN, with one of the rare cases in 1947 where the United States and the Soviet Union acted together, appointed a commission, the United Nations Special Commission on Palestine, or UNSCOP, to visit and make recommendations. And very important recommendations. The majority of the committee came out for the same kind of recommendation that the Peel Commission had made in 1937, 10 years later. That is, dividing or partitioning Palestine into a Jewish state and into an Arab state, with the idea of economic cooperation. Jerusalem would be a separate area. Very, very interesting. The Minority Report called for a federal state, but there would be an Arab and Jewish municipality in Jerusalem. Now, what kind of corpus separandum did the Majority Report want? It wanted an international regime covering all of Jerusalem under the control of the Trusteeship Council, with the governor, and one hears this today, so it's worthwhile, I think, taking a few minutes on it, with the governor appointed by the Trusteeship Council, a legislative body elected by universal manhood suffrage and womanhood suffrage, for that matter. But the governor could veto any laws passed by the municipal council and could promulgate his own laws in the absence of the council. Now, the key clause in this whole business was that after 10 years, the population at large would have a referendum and then could make a decision as to what it wanted its future. Now, this is key for the following reason. Jerusalem, for reasons that I've already mentioned, has been very key in Jewish history, and the Jews were rather unwilling to see Jerusalem, which was already a large Jewish city, separated from the body of Israel proper. But on the understanding that 10 years later there would be a referendum, and given the fact they had the majority of the population, it was fairly clear which way the referendum would go, might be rejoined to Jerusalem, to Israel, they would be willing to go along with it. The Arabs absolutely rejected it. And war was to come. Now, I think for understanding the situation in Jerusalem today, it's key to understand the two wars which racked Jerusalem, one in 1948 and one in 1967, because that's key to understanding the present situation. Guerrilla warfare began right after the UN voted partition in November of 1947, accepted the majority report. Guerrilla warfare, even though the British were there, ran from November of 1947 until May of 1948. During that period, the Arabs slowly but surely, you can see the old border, surrounded Jerusalem, cut off water, cut off supplies of goods, essentially isolating the city. It was felt by the Jews that, look, it's supposed to be an international city, the international community, the UN will come to the aid of the Jews here. But it didn't. And when the war itself broke out in full scale with a number of Arab armies, including the Jordanians, invading in May of 1948, the Egyptians from here, the Jordanians from here, the Lebanese and the Syrians and the Iraqis up higher, there was an appeal to the UN for support. There were 3 water pipelines in Arab territory. These were cut, leaving 100,000 Jews without water. This is in May, by the way, in Jerusalem when it's hot. Some was saved in cisterns, not a lot. There was heavy shelling of the Jewish section of Jerusalem from the hills around the city. Again, you have a map that I'll come to in a minute, but you can see these are mountain areas around here. The Jewish section of the city, western part, was heavily vulnerable. Hospitals, schools, bombs landed near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as well. The Israelis had no heavy mortars to reply. The Israelis at the UN time and time again said, look, you made this an international city. Save the city from the war. Nothing happened. The older part of the city, the walled city, was captured by Jordan in late May. The siege was finally lifted in June when Jewish forces built a separate road to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv-Yafa. However, this had what might be termed a major traumatic feeling for the Jews, saying the UN international community did not help us. The only way we can be protected is by the Israeli army itself. You're talking about 100,000 Jews, 1/6 of the population, Jewish population in the country in 1948. Now, just as Jerusalem had, or Jewish end of Jerusalem had survived its first siege, to make the reputation of the UN even worse in Jerusalem, among the Jewish community at least, than it was before, up steps the UN mediator, Count Bernadotte, who in June, right after the siege is lifted, at the time of the first truce in the war, says, well, Jerusalem in any future solution has to be part of the Palestinian Arab state. This is after the Jews had just survived the siege. This was rejected not only by the Jewish community of Palestine, but also by France and the USSR. By September, the tide of the war had changed. The Israelis had now conquered the Galilee, a good chunk of the coastal strip. We were beginning to move on the Egyptian army, which was in the south, between Gaza and Beersheba. At this time, Bernadotte announces he is going, the UN mediator announces he's going back to Jerusalem from his place on Rhodes, which had been his headquarters. Interestingly enough, he was warned by the military governor, the Jewish military governor of Jerusalem, Joseph, and also the U.S. ambassador to Israel, McDonald, don't come, Jerusalem is dangerous. He came anyway, got himself assassinated by Lehi, or the Stern Gang, a Jewish terrorist organization, in September of 1948. Now, just as the time he was assassinated, he had promulgated yet another plan for Jerusalem, and that was a Jerusalem under United Nations control, with maximum local autonomy and full safeguard for the holy places. Now, this issue of an internationalized Jerusalem became a hot political football at the UN for the next 2 years, from September 1948 really until February of 1950. It went the following way. The Vatican, representing Catholic interests now, was very concerned when Muslim Jordan captured the old city where the holy places are, feeling that if Christianity was to survive, it might be somewhat questionable under the Jordanians. As a result, the Vatican called for full internationalization. On the opposite end of the spectrum, and we're talking about, there are two kinds of internationalization here. Full territorial internationalization. That is the corpus separatum, this whole area of Jerusalem that the UN had called for in the Majority Committee in 1947, separated off from both Jordan and from Israel. The total opposite end of the spectrum was Jordan itself, which had captured the old city, and King Abdullah is quoted as saying, when he heard of the plan, and I'm quoting now, "Jerusalem would be internationalized over my dead body." End of quote. That's the King of Jordan. The Israelis took a somewhat more centrist position, opposed strongly territorial internationalization for the experiences of the war, but said the holy places, now there's a difference, remember, sovereignty over the city, internationalize it, but the holy places could be internationalized. This is sometimes called functional internationalization. Give the UN or the international bodies just control over the holy places, which are mostly in the old city. It was fairly easy, I might add, for the Israelis to say that because most of the holy places, 30 out of 32, were under Jordanian control. A fourth but similar plan was suggested by Holland, Sweden, and Bolivia, and later endorsed by the United States. That called for functional internationalization, the holy places under international control, but on the proviso, under the same kind of agreement, that the UN is independent UN territory, but it has a host agreement with the United States. Jerusalem, the holy places, would be the similar kind of international system, but under host agreements either with Israel or with Jordan. Well, these are the different plans. Full territorial internationalization, no internationalization at all, and internationalization of the holy places. After some debate, the UN General Assembly voted for full territorial internationalization. And then in a rare display of harmony, Jordan and Israel met secretly to plan how they were jointly going to oppose the internationalization of Jerusalem. That was the 1949 plan. By 1950, support for this overall idea of territorial internationalization had died. The idea of functional internationalization had come to the fore, that is, for the holy places, but nothing could get full support. And the issue of Jerusalem essentially died in the UN in 1950. Israel declared it to be the capital of Israel, Jerusalem, capital of Israel. The United States said it would not recognize it. Some countries did, other countries did not. The United States did not. Russia pulled out of the whole discussions. The Arabs themselves split. Jordan said no to any kind of internationalization. The other Arabs who didn't like King Abdullah, and the Arabs were split on this, said, let's internationalize the whole city, rather than have Abdullah have the prestige of controlling the holy places. Okay. What did the divided city look like between 1948 and 1967? I think this is the next stage. How were the holy places preserved or not? How was sovereignty over the city preserved? What happened? The Jordanians succeeded, and this is first King Abdullah and later King Hussein, although to a lesser degree, of antagonizing every group in Jerusalem, in the old city. They antagonized the Palestinians. Remember, according to the original UN plan, there's supposed to be an independent Jewish state in Palestine and an independent Palestinian state in Palestine. When Jordan invaded, it kept the bulk of what was supposed to be this independent Palestinian state, and the Egyptians got a chunk of it over here in Gaza. The Israelis wound up with a chunk up in the north in the Galilee. All right, how did Hussein succeed in alienating most everybody? The problem for first his grandfather Abdullah and then Hussein was Jerusalem was the center of Arab opposition, of Palestinian nationalist opposition. Hence, when there was money to develop, it went to the capital of Jordan, Amman, it went to Hebron in the south, or Nablus to the north. It was a very careful, distinct policy of first Abdullah and then Hussein not to have Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, develop. Much more was invested in Nablus and Hebron. East Jerusalem was not made the joint capital of Jordan or even the capital of the West Bank. The Saudis, who wanted to build a school, a secondary school in East Jerusalem, were told, no, build it in Amman. They encouraged a number of Hebronites from the southern West Bank city down here to come move to Jerusalem so they could balance out the other Palestinians in the city. And very little land development went on in East Jerusalem. This was to cost the Jordanians after the 67 war, particularly in the north, when a lot of the Israeli building went on undeveloped land. Okay. That was his treatment of the Muslims of East Jerusalem. The record of Jordan as a custodian of the holy places between 1948 and 1967 is also not particularly pleasant. The Israeli Jews, despite the provisions of the armistice, and this is important, of 1949, between Jordan and Israel, and Article 8 of the Armistice Agreement, were not permitted to visit the western wall of the temple, the holiest Jewish shrine, or the Mount of Olives, where their main cemetery were. Israeli Muslims were not permitted to visit their holy places, the Mosque of Omar or Al-Aqsa, and Israeli Christians were permitted to visit the holy places only on Christmas, or if they held dual nationality, on Christmas and in Easter. Okay, that's as custodian of the holy places. What about his treatment of others in East Jerusalem? Jordan built a road through the Jewish cemetery on the Mount of Olives, which is the holiest Jewish cemetery in the world. Many tombstones, as I think most of you are aware, used for road paving, fortifications, or even latrines. In addition, virtually all the Jewish synagogues in the old city of Jerusalem were destroyed. From the Christian point of view, Jordan, by law, formally prohibited the building of any Christian churches or the acquisition by existing churches of any additional land. It also forced Christian schools to give equal time to the Bible and the Quran. They deported the Armenian Patriarch of Jerusalem. Indeed, if one looks in general at the climate for Christians in Jordanian-controlled Jerusalem, the climate was so bad that the number of Christians dropped from 25,000 in 1948 to 10,800 in May of 67. And a Christian had to take Friday off, which is the Muslim holy day. He was only allowed, if he worked in a government office, to take off until 10 a.m. on Sunday, which is the Christian holy day. Okay. I think that gives you enough taste of what was going on in East Jerusalem. Again, I don't want to be melodramatic here, but these, unfortunately, are the facts as the way the city was run, or not run. 1967 war was the second trauma to the city. Again, if we had time, we'd go into the causes of the war. We don't. Essentially, this was a conflict between Israel on the one hand and Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The Egyptians moving troops up, the Israelis preempting. Israel, it should be mentioned, through the UN, urged Hussein not to get involved in the fighting. Said, if you don't get involved in the fighting, you will not get hurt. The Jordanians chose not to and started, again, massive shelling from the hills around Jerusalem. Now, if you could pull out your second map, if you would, which is the map of Jerusalem after 1967. It says the occupied areas. And you look at the slanted lines. The Israeli building of housing in East Jerusalem, which has been heavily criticized in the United States and elsewhere, but if you look very carefully, this housing has been built on the hills from which Jewish Jerusalem was shelled not only in 1948, but viciously in 1967. Some evidence of the destruction, and this is taken from the American Consul General in Jerusalem, Edmund Wilson, who wrote a book on Jerusalem, Evan Wilson. According to his statistics, 1,300 private homes were hit. Hadassah Hospital, the major Jewish hospital, was hit. The Israel Museum was hit. The dome of the Church of the Dormition on Mount Zion was hit. After this shelling, the Israelis decided never again, in the sense that never again could these hills be used as they were in 48 and 67 to shell Israel. The end result was, if you look, the whole development of the city after 67 has been on the hills around to prevent the shelling. Okay. A second thing to come out of the war, the Jordan's destruction of the Jewish quarter of the city and the cemetery on the Mount of Olives, and the Jewish prohibition of worship at the western wall of the temple, all three together combined to lead the Israelis to call for the unification of the city under Israeli control, which they did in June of 1967. What was the reaction? The United States said no unilateral moves by Israel would be accepted, opposed any unilateral action. However, very interesting to note that the American representative of the UN said the solution of Jerusalem must be one of negotiation, and this between Israel and its neighbors. This has been American policy from the beginning, but the issue of Jerusalem should be understood as one element of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Vatican, second reaction, having seen the deterioration of Christian status in East Jerusalem, once again called for internationalization. It said, from its point of view, look,